At this time, I would like to introduce our speaker, Mary Mason. She is the great-great-granddaughter of pioneer settler and lumberman Peter Dalton, and she will be telling us about the Dalton family and their arrival from Ireland to the White Lake area from 1830 to 1900. At this time, I'd like to welcome Mary Mason.
To me, well, let me start with a couple things. I'm the great-great-granddaughter of Peter Dalton, but there are some others of our generation here. Back here in this back table is my brother Kevin and my cousin Dale Mason. And they both grew up around here and are still around the area, at least sometimes. I also want to thank, before I start, my husband Jim Barton back there, who prepared this nice board up here and did some handouts and has done a lot of other things just to keep me going to get this done and ready. So history to me, I mean, when I was in school, I never much liked history. It was, I could do it, I could memorize all those names and dates and events, but it never really meant anything to me. Didn't realize that all the biographies that I was reading were history, my favorite books. So to me, history is people and their stories. And what I'm doing tonight is history as accurate as I can get it. But for me, I've embedded it in a story. Sort of reminds me a little bit of a fairy tale. So that ties it all together. You'll see I've used a little bit of AI. That's been fun. This picture behind this was created by AI when I asked it for a typical tenant farm in Ireland in the 1830s. This is a little idyllic compared to reality, but it pulls it together pretty well. One more caveat before I start. Ages, when you're doing genealogy, are very, very fuzzy kinds of things. One of the people that I'm talking about tonight had ages that put her anywhere in about a 30-year range in the censuses over time. I think I know how old she was, but I rely on the gravestones, which are not really any more accurate than anything else. So I'm going to talk on some themes tonight. First of all is the immigrant story. People chasing the American dream. And this family was doing that before it was ever called the American dream, starting around 1830. It's a story of family cohesion. I was surprised as I researched this to find that the family really stuck together, worked together through all the moves and changes and time. And the historical part is the historical development of Michigan and the Midwest a bit, but especially the lumbering era in Michigan and particularly around White Lake. The rise and fall of that and some things about what it was like at the time. So this picture in the background here is an idealized farm of what a typical tenant farmer would have in 1830. The house is fairly typical. It's 1 or 2 rooms, very small, made out of mud and with a thatched roof. So the question is, how did the Dalton family, get from here in Ireland, where I've just recently learned they lived in Legan Townland. It took me decades to find that, up there in Roscommon County. And this is another AI-generated picture. To here. In 1900, there were 6 of those 9 people buried in the Whitehall and Montague cemeteries. That seems a little curious that many of them would have ended up here. All of them who came from Ireland had died by 1900, and the 6 buried there are 6 of the 7 children of the family. So we'll talk about how they got from Ireland in 1830 to their final resting place here in 1900. This tree is the eastern white pine, which was the tree that was the demand in the lumber industry. It brought people here from all over the country, all over the world, to cut down these trees, and Michigan was full of them. So the Dalton story is very much tied up with the story of lumbering in Michigan. And every time I think of that story, I think, once upon a time. Once upon a time, a long time ago, in a land far away, there lived a family named Dalton. What you see behind them is a typical house that they would have lived in. They were a step above the lowest tenant farmers. So they had a little bit nicer house, but there were Mom and Dad and the 7 children. Dad, James Sr., at that point was about age 49. Mother, Margaret, was 43. The oldest child, Mary, age 18, still at home, unmarried, which was unusual for that time. Edward, the oldest son, was age 16. He was away at school. He was going to the Latin school, Catholic school, which was a secondary school in the nearby town. And then Catherine, age 11. And then the boys, Joseph, age 10. James, age 5. Peter, my great-great-grandfather, age 2. It took me a while to wrap my head around the fact that he actually was 2 years old at some point in time. And then the baby Andrew, who was just born in 1830, and I think probably precipitated the decision to leave Ireland and come to this country. Now, the 6 who are buried in the cemetery here are Mary, Edward, Catherine, James, Peter, and Andrew. But only 3 of those, Catherine, James, and Peter, actually lived here. The others came here to die, I guess, and they're all buried here. So even though they didn't live here, the connection to White Lake was strong for the whole family. Now this is what would be called a typical middleman farm. Again, rather idyllic, and it's more the type of house that this Dalton family would have had. He was, rather than being a tenant at the bottom of the rung, he was a strong farmer or a middleman, which meant that he was one step up. He would lease land from the landlord, work part of it himself, and lease the rest of it to other tenant or 2. So that gave him not a wealthy existence, but he had a better house, they had better food, and they had some better standing in the community. And he probably worked his own farm and had at least 2 farms totaling 22 acres, which was a pretty decent holding in Ireland at the time. It was a small, very crowded country. So James took advantage of his extra position to educate his son Edward, and I assume he educated the younger boys as well. It was unusual in Ireland at that time, for Catholics especially, to be able to go to school. And somehow he managed that. So if you look at James and Margaret thinking about the future for their children, especially with 5 sons who were going to have to support themselves someday, in Ireland right then, but their future was better really than most in Ireland. So why would they want to leave Ireland? What was it like in Ireland in 1830? A lot of people say, well, they left Ireland. Was it because of the potato famine? But no, the potato famine was not going to happen for 15 more years. But a lot of the conditions that led to the potato famine were still happening at that time. They just got worse over time. So there was a lot of economic hardship and poverty. Most of the population were tenant farmers of the lowest level. And unlike the farm I showed you at the beginning that was kind of idyllic, they were much more crowded than that, and life was difficult. There was little industry for anybody to get another job. They were pretty much trapped where they were. And the population was growing. There was no more land to be had, so they were dividing land in the next generations. and it was getting smaller and harder to survive. There was a lot of political and religious discrimination, especially against Catholics, who had been actually subjected to penal laws up until about 1829, and a lot of those restrictions were still there on education, owning land, the kinds of work they could do, places they could go. So when it comes down to the Dalton family, there was a lack of opportunity looking ahead. The leasehold they held was too small to divide up among their 5 sons. Very insecure. Everything was subject to the whims of the landlord at the time. Landlords were absent. They were usually British, often lived in England. Some lived in Ireland. So they were distant. And if they decided that they didn't want to have that farm anymore, they could just throw you off. And so all of these circumstances kind of combined to provide a push for that family to leave Ireland. So then the question is, why go to Michigan? Apparently there was information circulating about the frontiers and the land available there. But this is kind of what the conception of Michigan was at that time. You can see they weren't really sure what the western coastline looked like. And if you take a look at the population where it's more dense, it starts down in the southeast and it kind of moves up and west. But by the time you get over to the west side and very far north, there's nothing there. Most of that was still under the control of the Native Americans who'd been there for generations. But the appeal, number one, was land. It was just beginning to open up for settlement. Treaties were being made with the Native Americans, and land was being sold relatively inexpensively, and there was a lot of it. That appeals to a farmer. They also had obviously a lot of room for expansion. You weren't going to be hemmed in like you were in Ireland. And the water allowed for transportation, easy transportation, and so you could get there, and if you had products you wanted to sell, eventually you could sell them that way. So the difficulty, of course, is that there's really not much of anybody or anything there, and you have to start pretty much from scratch. So the way it worked basically the Michigan territory at the time was the land would be owned by the federal government. They would obtain it through treaties with the Native Americans and then would survey it and eventually open it up for sale when they opened a land office. So there's quite a different amount of time between the time they actually owned it and would sell it. If you look at the lower section there south of the Grand River, the treaty with the Native Americans was in 1821, but the land wasn't really opened up for sale until about 1830, by the time they finished surveying it. And if you look north of the Grand River, that treaty was in 1836. So when the Daltons went there, that was all still Native American land, not open for settlement and not particularly hospitable for strangers. And unlike in the farther west, we're all familiar with the homesteading. You had to go in and stake your claim and live there for a while and then claim. At this point, they weren't doing that yet. There was a principle called preemption. If you got there before they surveyed it and you were there, then you had you could preempt ownership when it did come up for sale. And in that case, you could buy it at the minimum price of $1.25 an acre. That was very appealing, again, to a farmer like James Dalton, who's never owned an acre in his life, and can buy hundreds and thousands of acres without a lot of trouble. So this is what the Michigan Territory and the states or territories of Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana looked like at about the time that the Daltons came. And again, you can see where the settlement had come from the east and from the south, much of it following water courses, the rivers, the Mississippi, the Ohio, and some coming down the St. Lawrence. And it was going north and going west. But if you look where Chicago would be, and you look at all of Michigan, there is nothing there. So in 1830, Michigan was the western frontier of the nation. And James Dalton, being a farmer, was tied to the land. He was squeezed by presence of population and the water that limited the size of the country. With 7 children to support, he was somewhat educated, at least he was literate, and he's looking for new opportunities for himself and his family. This is very appealing. So in 1830, Andrew was born. 1832, James decides that he's going to America. I don't know if he had headed for Michigan to begin with, but I assume he probably did. And which surprised me, he took his 13-year-old daughter, Catherine, with him. Now, I have a daughter, Catherine, and I can maybe understand that. Maybe it runs in the family. She must have been mature for her age, able to help out her father, and have a bit of an adventurous spirit to be willing to go like that. So in 1832, Edward, now 18, leaves school before he's finished to come home and manage the 2 farms that Dad's leaving behind. He'll probably be working one and collecting tenants and rents and managing the other one. In 1834, the rest of the family follows James to Michigan, where James has already been set up, St. Joseph. So this is kind of what the trip they would take looked like. It's a long trip from, well, somehow New York moved. Anyway, a long trip across the ocean from New York to, from Ireland to New York. And it looks kind of peaceful here. But in reality, it looked a bit more like that. And this is the kind of ship that they would have sailed on across the ocean. The trip would usually take 6 to 12 weeks, depending on the weather. Could take a couple weeks more, a couple weeks less. And you had no idea what was going to happen. If you didn't have any money, you'd be in the steerage, which is down below decks, just wide open, bunks, and not very pleasant. The Daltons may have had a little bit more money. They may have been able to buy a passage in a cabin that's more toward the rear of the ship, but I don't know. James apparently had enough money when he left Ireland to pay for his passage and buy land when he got here, so he had something. So once they got to New York, they had to get around to St. Joe, and you can see the blue line shows the route they had to take at that time. Overland, it just didn't happen. It was pretty much all by water. So they would start from New York and go up the Hudson River on a Hudson River steamboat to Albany. Once they got to Albany, they were lucky. In 1825, the Erie Canal had opened, and they could get on a packet boat pulled by mules to go down the Erie Canal to Buffalo. When they got to Buffalo, they're at the beginning of the Great Lakes. As they took the Erie Canal, they bypassed the Niagara Falls, which made everything a lot easier for them. So in Buffalo, they got on actually the first steamboat that went from Buffalo around to St. Joseph, the Sandusky. They got on that steamboat and then made a stop probably in Detroit. Detroit was pretty well settled at the time. There was a fort there. And then went on from there to Mackinac, where they were resupplying the fort at Mackinac. From there, they'd go around to St. Joseph. Might have stopped at Green Bay or Milwaukee. I think there was a fort at Green Bay, but there was virtually nothing there. You could go overland across the southern part of Michigan, but it was not something that anybody tackled willingly, and certainly not with a family. So my assumption, I was surprised when I found out they went to St. Joe. I thought, why didn't they go to Chicago? Doesn't that seem like a rational question to ask? Chicago's always been more settled. There's a picture of the Hudson River steamer. And this is the kind of boat they'd have taken on the Erie Canal, shallow bottom, fairly small, very slow moving. But there were cabins that you could sleep in, and it was reasonably comfortable. And this was more of the Great Lakes steamer that they would have taken around to St. Joe. It's compared to the Hudson River steamer. The Hudson River steamer was almost more of a pleasure boat. The Hudson River was pretty calm. They didn't have to deal with bad weather. Not a lot of problems. They had the masts up there just in case, but they almost never had to raise any sails. The Great Lakes steamer is more of a working boat. It had to deal with the unpredictable weather of the Great Lakes and had masts that actually could hold sails that worked because they needed them from time to time. So back to this. Why not Chicago? Well, in 1832, Fort Dearborn was the primary installation in Chicago. They'd been there for a while. But they had just been involved in the Black Hawk War with the Native Americans, which they finally ended in 1832. So there weren't a lot of people there. And if you look at the picture below in 1833, there wasn't much there. A few houses, looks like a couple of Native American teepees, and that was about it. So St. Joe, compared to that, was a bustling port. And if you notice, this 1833 picture is at the fork of the north and south branches of the Chicago River, right in the heart of Chicago today. So that was where it started, and not much yet. So they went to St. Joseph rather than Chicago. In 1830, the land became available for sale in the southern part of the state, below the Grand River. So St. Joe was growing. It was right at the mouth of the St. Joseph River, which came through the southern part of the state, dipped into Indiana, and was actually a fairly well-used pathway for people to get to that part of the country. And along that river, not too far from St. Joe, was Fort St. Joseph. So there was traffic there to and through that fort. In 1829, the first log house of a settler was built in St. Joseph. So it was just before Dalton got there. So in 1831, the village of St. Joseph was platted right at the mouth of the St. Joseph River, right where it runs into Lake Michigan. And I don't know if you've been to St. Joe, but there's a hill that comes right up, right from down there. So the lots down along the edge are all below the hill, and everything else is up above. So James Dalton must have brought money with him, because by 1833, he bought himself a lot in the New Village Plat, right down almost on the water. He was a farmer, so I'm not sure what he was thinking when he bought that. But he had also bought other land, larger plots of land around one just south of St. Joe that sits up on the bluff above Lake Michigan, beautiful spot. But I think he bought it to farm it. And later on, he bought more land across the river and actually did farm it. But what he did here, before his family arrived in 1834, he bought that lot and he had built a house on it. So in 1834, the rest of the family arrives. Edward, now 20 years old, has managed the family farms for 2 years, manages from the proceeds of that to pay for the family's passage, all 7 of them, from Ireland to St. Joe, and hands his father a significant sum of money in gold when he arrives. So obviously he was very responsible and paid attention to things. So by this time, he's managed adult responsibilities for a while. So from this point forward, he and his father worked more together in a partnership. 1834 and 35, they bought more land, and I think they moved the family to the other side of the river to farm over there at that point. 1835 and 36, they built a hotel on their lot downtown in St. Joseph. I didn't realize that at first until my first clue of that was when I found something talking about James Dalton being taxed as a tavern keeper in 1837. And at the same time, he was taxed as being a public house keeper. So then later, I found something that Edward said they built a hotel there. So they ran that hotel for about a year or so. And you'd think that they're here, they're settled, they've got a place to live, they're farming, they've actually got a successful hotel. They made it. What more do they want? And that's one of the things I like about AI is I gave it all this information and I said, you know, what can you tell me about this? So I can read this to you. I thought it was particularly insightful and much better written than I could write. For the Daltons, this was not an impoverished flight, but a deliberate relocation. So many people, especially later, came because they had no choice. Financed by strategic management of their Irish holdings during the transition. While James had laid the groundwork in Michigan, Edward arrived with capital that would strengthen the family's farming operation and position them for long-term success in the American Midwest. Should be the end of the story. But they're looking for new opportunity. After farming and running a hotel at a very strategic location in St. Joe, James was observing and gathering information from that spot. One of the things I expect he saw was, I read somewhere that the first ship bringing lumber into Chicago came from St. Joe in 1833. It would have floated right past him. So James and Edward decided that the lumbering business was had much better prospects for their family than anything else. Now the problem is that St. Joe and that area didn't have the right kind of timber. They didn't have eastern pine. They had a few hardwoods, but that was about it. So they needed to go further north. And where did they decide to go? The Grand River, the next big river north. And there was plenty of pine up there. So they set out, Edward and James, in 1838 for Grand Rapids. Grand Rapids was just a new city, growing, had a lot of potential, and was only 40 miles or so from Grand Haven, which was the port on the Grand River. So they managed to take a boat, somehow get up Lake Michigan, all the way up the Grand River to Grand Rapids, where they bought some land, which is right in the city of Grand Rapids now. In fact, I have a cousin on the other side of the family who lives on some of that land today, in the city. But they didn't stay there very long. They soon decided to move a little farther west along the river, looking for an appropriate spot on the river where they could build a water mill. Now, water mills were the only thing that really was working in western Michigan at the time. There were some steam mills on the East Coast, but they hadn't arrived here yet. And to have a water mill, you needed to have a water source. You needed to have something that could be dammed to create enough of a strong enough stream to turn the wheels and run your mill. So they had to find something, usually a small river or creek, and they needed some place for their lumber to go when it got through the mill, so they needed to be on a river. So they went up the Grand River and they found Sand Creek, which is right on the Grand River. Good place to put a mill and a dam, and near places with standing pine timber. And because the mills had to be, they didn't have much in the way of transportation to get lumber to the mill, they needed to be near the water and near the lumber. So here's the Sand Creek mill site today, where they finally settled. It's kind of hard to see, but I tried to label it. The Grand River comes down from the north over there and then does a bend and then goes on. You see Jenison is here now. Lake Michigan Drive, if you're familiar with that, runs right up across the top. And they put their mill right there. in the bend of the river, bought a lot of land there that had pine timber on it, and settled down. They had the entire family living at Sand Creek by the 1840 census. And Sand Creek was in Talmadge Township in Ottawa County, just over the line from Kent County. And it was about halfway between Grand Rapids and Grand Haven, so they were in the middle of absolutely nowhere. There was nobody there, nothing going on. But if they wanted to have any available place for supplies, they weren't that far, and it was up the river or down the river to Grand Haven and Grand Rapids. So they're at Sand Creek, established there in 1845 with the whole family there. But the boys are getting older. They're between 14 and 30 years old now. So even young Andrew is getting old enough. And they're looking for something more for these boys to do. Edward in particular is looking for some way to become more independent on his own. He's 30 years old now, been working responsibly for a long time. So they looked around and realized they needed a place to sell their lumber. They can cut it down, they can mill it, turn it into boards, they can get it out to the Lake Michigan, but what do they do with it then? So Chicago was growing rapidly at that point. It wasn't much when they first got there, but it took off. But it was limited by the fact that there was just not much lumber there, not a lot of trees. So in 1845, Edward went to Chicago, established a lumber yard at the corner of Clinton and Randolph Streets, just on the west side of the south branch of the river, right on the water. And he worked that for a while. About a year later, Edward went back to Talmadge to take care of the mill on Sand Creek, and he wanted to farm. Edward really still wanted to farm. So he was buying some land to farm. So he went back to run the mill and farm. So when Edward went back there, his father went down and took over the lumber yard in Chicago. And that's pretty much where he spent the rest of his life and career, was running the lumber yard in Chicago. Somewhere in that time period, 1845 to 47, Margaret, James's wife, the mother of the children, died at Sand Creek. I suspect that might have had something to do with the fact that James was ready to pack up and move to Chicago. And there's what Chicago looked like in 1845. A lot more there than there was 10, 12 years earlier. As they opened up more and more land to the west, more and more people came. The pressure just kept coming. So then they needed to expand the business further. They still hadn't taken care of the other boys. What were they going to do? They've got the mill at Sand Creek. They've got the lumber yard at Chicago. And here's where they decide to go north so that the younger boys have a place to settle and work. So where do they end up? White Lake. That's not where they set out to go. In 1845 sometime, and I don't know how Edward did that because he was also opening a lumber yard in Chicago, but I guess he had a lot of time. Edward and James was I think 19 about then, headed north, planning to go to Manistee because that's where they heard there was new opportunity for lumbering up on the Manistee River. So I think they did a lot of rafting and walking. Went down the Grand River to Lake Michigan, up along Lake Michigan to White Lake, where they found Charles Mears with his lumber mill on the lake. And they were pretty worn out, so they stopped and spent a day or two with Charles Mears, talked to him about the lumbering business around White Lake, and they were kind of intrigued. But Mears told them that there wasn't enough lumber for more than one mill around White Lake, so they needed to just keep going. So they set out to keep going farther north, and the stories vary. One story says it was Native Americans, one story says it was some of the people who worked for Mears who were ferrying them across White Lake, White River, and mentioned that there was this really nice place that would be good for a mill right up on Silver Creek, just up the White River a little ways from White Lake. But they didn't think too much about it because they'd been told there wasn't room for another lumber yard or lumber business there. So they continued on north, but then kind of had second thoughts and turned around and came back and checked out that place. And they thought, oh, this is a really good place to build a mill. Turns out that land was owned by Charles Mears, who had picked that as his first mill site, but then changed his mind and built on White Lake instead. Whatever the issue was with Mears, they settled it. In 1846, Charles Mears sold them that land, and at the same time they bought other land around it so they have the timber to feed the mill. So after that, they picked out the site. They returned all the way back down the White River, all the way through White Lake, down Lake Michigan, back up the Grand River to Sand Creek to build the mill equipment. So 1845, 46, they're building the mill equipment over the winter. In the spring, they're ready to go back. But Edward is otherwise occupied, so James goes back on his own. And I'm not sure if he took Peter with him or not. Peter was still a little kid. He was about 17, 18. Anyway, so James goes back, again, rafting all of this equipment down the Grand River, up Lake Michigan, through White Lake, up White River to Sand Creek, where they install that. And in 1846, I have a contract where they hired somebody to actually build the mill facilities there. So he begins operating the mill. James is now settled up there with that mill. Peter at some point comes and joins him up here. So that is where Peter and James are settling at this point. But at this point, it's hard to say that all the family members seem to be traveling freely between White Lake, Sand Creek, and Chicago. I don't know how they end up in these different places at different times. But we wouldn't do it today, that's for sure. So here's the mill site the way it looks today. Thank you, Google Maps. There's the White River. And there's the mouth of Silver Creek on White River. And up there is where Silver Creek comes down across from the north. It goes a long way. The dam and the mill right there. We went out there a couple of weeks ago just to see what we could see. It's pretty hard to see anything, but there is a dam there now. There have been other mills since then. There was, I think, a grist mill there most recently that burned down not too long ago. But I think that's probably where the dam was, and the mill was right in that vicinity somewhere. And then there's the mill pond. So this had what you needed for a water mill. It had a creek that ended up in the main river with a spot where you could build a dam and back up the water to create a mill pond. So now they can cut the trees from the land around there, transport it to the mill pond, float it down the mill pond to the mill, run it through the mill, float the lumber out into White River where they can pick it up on smaller boats, and then take it out to Lake Michigan. Now, at this time, it wasn't as easy to get from White Lake to Lake Michigan as it is now either. A lot of you are probably familiar with the old channel. And that's all they had at the time, was a very narrow channel out to Lake Michigan that you couldn't navigate very well with any boat of any size. So they had to put it onto what they called lighters, take them out through the channel, and then the big boats would be out in Lake Michigan to load the lumber and take it wherever it was going. So the Daltons were settling in here. Here's something I want to read to you. In 1848, according to the History of Muskegon County, published in 1882, Captain James Dalton states that the first 4th of July celebration in White River was in 1848 in the presence of about 50 Indians and 20 whites. The captain was the orator of the day, and after a sumptuous repast of pork and beans, the whites hurrahed, and the Indians, who felt quite patriotic, joined in the shout. The schooner Mitchell hoisted the flag, and here's the interesting part. There were about half a dozen of the fair sex in White River then. So 1848, when they got there, there wasn't much here either yet. but it was the beginning of something really big. So now they're settled again. They were settled in St. Joe. I thought they'd be happy there, but no. So now Edward is at Sand Creek running the mill and farming. Ultimately, he's farming about 1,500 acres, a far cry from the 22 that the whole family shared back in Ireland. And as I said before, Margaret died between 1845 and 47 somewhere. Andrew, now a teenager, is staying at Sand Creek in the mill business. The rest of the family is based in Chicago. James Sr. at the lumber yard. Joseph, the middle brother, is now a lumber dealer, traveling between White Lake, Sand Creek, and Chicago, trying to sell the lumber from the lumber yard. James and Peter are traveling between White Lake and Chicago. And by 1860, Catherine, James, and Peter are all living at the White River Mill. So now they're established in 3 locations that would serve at key points of the future. They're in Ottawa County, White River, and Chicago. With these points established, they now can harvest the timber, they can mill the timber, and they can sell it. But they still have to hire somebody else to transport the lumber. James Jr. takes that on and earns the title captain that he carried through the rest of his life. So I would say at this point they lived happily ever after. But the story continues. At some point, James Jr. buys, we'll call him Captain Dalton now, buys the Bluebell, a schooner, a lumber schooner that obviously sails and begins to run the lumber himself between the mills and Chicago. Since they needed to buy ship lumber from both of the places, James had grown up around the water, obviously, coming to St. Joe as a boy, spending time there, and then on the Grand River. And he really kind of liked the life on the water. So he started really before this. He and Isaiah Carlton, one of his neighbors up there on the White River, had brought from the Grand River a boat that James had built that was the first steamboat to be on White Lake. Made it out of 2 canoes with something straddling them. And anyway, they used it to take their lumber from their mills out to Lake Michigan. So he kind of got the bug. And he not only transported the family's lumber, but he also worked for a lot of other people, captained their boats, took their lumber, did some passenger. He was based in Grand Haven for the most part, and read a lot about him in the ancient Grand Haven newspapers, captaining different boats and doing different things. So that was his life. Mostly he left the mill up here to Peter, who managed the mill. Now there's a story that says he gave up sailing after a particularly bad experience with the Bluebell, where the ship capsized and threw everybody into the water, and they finally got rescued after about 24 hours. And after that, he said, "I'm not doing this anymore." I don't know if that's true or not, but eventually he did stop, but that was at a different time. All of these places, from one little spot down in St. Joe that they aren't in at all anymore. They've pretty much sold everything down there. They've got Chicago, they've got Sand Creek, they've got Silver Creek, and now they're getting involved with the ports at White Lake and in Grand Haven, Grand River. And here's where James would be taking his routes to take his own lumber to the lumber yard. And this kind of shows a bit of an expanded route that he would be taking. He went to Milwaukee sometimes, different places. These mills are all water mills. There's a very limited capacity, and transporting lumber to and from, trees to and lumber from, is a little difficult. Doesn't allow them to produce very much. But about this time, the ferries, who were lumbering in this area, built a steam mill on White Lake. And the Daltons saw that and thought it was time for them to upgrade. So they kept the the mill on Silver Creek, the old water mill, built themselves a steam mill at Short Point. And this was the mill there. Short Point is Blueberry Ridge, Dowie Point, if you know where that is, on White Lake. The benefit of a steam mill was you didn't need to run it with water. You didn't need to limit where you could put it. You could go other places than just on a small creek that could be dammed. You had the water on the lake, which is a lot closer to where you want to get the lumber loaded onto ships and send it away. So they built this mill, 1857. They also built some of the typical buildings that you would have. You realize that a sawmill is a major enterprise. You don't just have people drive in and go to work. A lot of them live there. You have to have a store. You have to have stables for your animals because you use horses and oxen. Shanties for the mill workers, or a boarding house. And at Short Point, Peter and James each had a 10-acre homestead where they built their homes and moved their families in. And this is the house that James built at Short Point. He later sold it to Alexander Dowie, or his wife did. Alexander Dowie, who made it, as one report said, very lavish. So he updated it, upgraded it. I'm not sure exactly what point this was, but this was the basic house. And you can still see bits of the foundation across from Hooker and down by the lake, just a little bit here and there. And there's a historical marker out there at Short Point right now. It's right out on Old Channel Trail at the end of one of the roads that goes out of there. So here's Short Point today. You see Old Channel Trail along the top, Blueberry Ridge, McFall Circle, you're probably familiar with that. And James Dalton's home site was right down there close to the, on the hill, close to the lake. And the mill site would be there. And you see it's right there on the lake. They can divert water from the lake for what they need. And steam powered the mill, so they didn't need the water power anymore. And both of the Daltons had their homes there, and they both lived there until their deaths. Both houses ultimately burned down. Okay, now here's a little side thing that I have on my notes. Wing It. My brother Jeff's back there. He'd recognize that. He has a band called Wingin' It. The creation of Muskegon County was fascinating. I spent a lot of time researching it, and there's a whole lot of messy detail that I'm not going to go into here. But basically, what happened was as the lumber industry was growing, we had big industry in Grand Haven. You had pretty good sized industry in Muskegon, on the Muskegon River, and then you had White Lake, White River. Well, Grand Haven, Muskegon took a look around, and at that time, Muskegon was part of Ottawa County. Part of Muskegon County was part of Ottawa County. You can kind of see the lower part. And the northern part of Muskegon County was either part of Oceana County or was kind of no man's land in terms of organization. I haven't figured that out. But what happened is that the people in Muskegon wanted to create their own county. And they wanted to get separate from Grand Haven. Grand Haven kind of looked at Muskegon as the backcountry Hicks. And Muskegon looked at White Lake as the backcountry Hicks. You always have to have the pecking order. So the lumbermen and businessmen in Muskegon decided they wanted to create their own county. And you can see the outline that they were proposing is what it is today. But there were these people in the northern part of what was Ottawa County at the time, the top two tiers of townships that were part of White Lake. And James Dalton had his mill at Silver Creek. Isaiah Carleton had come not too long after that, had a mill right nearby, less than a mile away. And they worked together quite a bit. And Isaiah Carleton, I think, was a bit of a politician. And he had in mind that he wanted to join Oceana County get away from those Muskegon people, didn't want them controlling him. He wanted to join Oceana County, there was pretty much nobody there. It was still primarily Native Americans, and there was a little bit of lumbering up in the farther north part around Pentwater. I think Charles Mears had a mill up there at one point, but not much there. So Carleton thought he could control all of that county from the south. And he wanted his mill site to be the county seat. He even planted some pine trees for the county square. And he really wanted that, and Dalton thought that was a good idea, apparently. So they got together with people from Grand Haven who did not want Muskegon County to be created because that would take Muskegon away from them, and they wanted Muskegon too. So they started, and this whole thing started about 1855, maybe before that, I can't tell. So they start maneuvering to figure out what to do. Ultimately, in 1858, James Dalton gets elected to the legislature, the state legislature, as a representative from this huge Ottawa County, Oceana County area. Henry Pennoyer from Grand Haven is elected to the state senate. The two of them are elected purposely to stop Muskegon County from happening. They got elected in November of 1858. They take office in January of 1859. February of 1859, the state legislature creates Muskegon County. Obviously, they didn't do their job. End of the story, right? No. So there's maneuvering, creating townships, doing strange, I don't know. Anyway, one of the townships they created at that time is called Dalton Township. And Peter Dalton was the first supervisor of that. I'm not quite sure what the politics were there, but that's the way it was. So they called the first meeting. Well, Carleton claims that the legislature didn't follow proper procedures in creating this county, and so it's not valid. So when the County Board of Supervisors calls its organizational meeting to organize the county, the White River folks, and Carleton was the supervisor of White River, refuse to answer. They show up, but they don't answer when their name's called. So they can't conduct business because they don't have a quorum. Well, ultimately they do it. They get together, and they organize the county. So Isaiah Carleton then files a lawsuit, which goes all the way to the state Supreme Court. And in the state Supreme Court, they finally lose. So it's finally over. Muskegon County exists. And if you pay attention to local news recently, I just saw something that the tension between the North Muskegon County people and the South Muskegon County people is still very real. In fact, in looking at this the other day, I found a letter to the editor that I had forgotten I wrote in 1996 to the Muskegon Chronicle saying, you know, this tension that's going on between North and South Muskegon County right now, it happened a long time ago too. So it's still there. These are the White Lake sawmills at the time, 1837 to 1865. The Daltons have the Silver Creek Mill and they have the Short Point Mill. They're living with their families in their houses at Short Point. So let me just do a quick, over the next 20 years, things are relatively calm on the business front. Personally, a lot's going on. The family grows some more and then begins to shrink. In 1856, Peter married Maria Lanford, whose family was another early pioneer here. They eventually had 5 children and adopted a daughter. 1861, Captain James married Emily Burroughs, another early family. They had 3 children. 1865, Joseph died in Chicago. I can't find much information about him other than that. He just kind of disappeared. 1868, youngest son, Andrew, married Mary Louisa Burroughs, who was Emily's sister, and had 2 children. In 1871, a big milestone for the family, James Sr. died in Chicago, age 90. 1872, Peter's wife Maria died, leaving him with 5 young children. But then in 1876, another major issue, Peter died in 1876. 1876, Andrew's wife Mary died, he remarried. And in 1878, another tragedy, the Short Point Mill burned. So one of the things that I found in some of my research is in Peter's estate. He died in 1876. And one of the things in there is a financial statement for Dalton Brothers, the partnership between Peter and James, showing all of their assets and their financial situation in 1876. That's pretty rare to have that from this time. But because Peter was a half partner in that business, that was part of his estate. So it kind of gives us a unique snapshot of the assets and the value of a small lumber business, and this was a relatively small business, as lumbering was peaking on White Lake around 1876. So the assets are listed, the lumber mills. They listed the Silver Creek Mill, which wasn't worth a lot, and the Short Point Mill, which was worth quite a bit more, and additions that were being put onto the Short Point Mill all go into that almost $35,000. Logging camps, one of the things you don't really necessarily think about when you have a sawmill, you have to have some place for your loggers to sleep and live while they're out in the woods in the middle of the winter. They had 2 logging camps and 1 camp store worth $7,000. The lumber yard in Chicago, they listed at $30,000. Timberlands, a lot of the acreage that they had, and they had hundreds of acres around the area, were worth $28,000. Then logging equipment, things like a couple of things I have up here, the poles and sleighs and things, another $2,500. They also owned a tugboat, which would be useful in moving boats up and down through the river, out through the lake. Animals, some cattle, but mostly horses and oxen, and some grain to feed them. Lumber, you see finished lumber, they had very little of that. They pretty much got it out of there and sold fairly quickly. And other assets, the biggest one was stock in the White River Log and Booming Company, which all of the local lumber dealers got together to create the Log and Booming Company to collect the logs as they came down the Grand River, or down the White River, and sort them out and send them off to the right mill. So they're all working together in their booming grounds, which were down here right by the bridge between Whitehall and Montague. So that was a big piece of their stock. So the total of that was like about almost $132,000. They had liabilities of close to $40,000, and that's an interesting list to read. A lot of familiar names from the history that they did business with, that they owed money and owed money to them. So the net value in 1876 was close to $93,000. So I was curious. I said, what would that be worth today? Net value in 1876 of $93,000 would be $2.8 million today. That's a small business. So you can see why there was so much tension and competition in the lumber business. There was money in it. It wasn't an easy business, but there was money to be had. And for the Daltons, this was just the 2 brothers here. This is what they had. Now that included their share of the lumber yard in Chicago, but there was other assets out there, way different from what they had in Ireland less than 50 years before. So you can see why the American dream and why immigrants have been driven to come here for a very, very long time. So, okay, after Peter died in 1876, James continued the business on behalf of the partnership, and he was also responsible for Peter's 5 children, who were aged 9 to 17 at the time. So after the Short Point Mill burned in 1878, rather than rebuild, he bought an existing mill across the lake. This is just for kind of a benchmark. This is what Montague looked like in 1879. Looking up, you can see up the hill the Ferry Memorial Church up there. Has been a landmark for a very long time. So there was a lot different than it was when he first came here in 1845, 1846. So in 1879, James went across the lake, and rather than rebuild Short Point, he bought the Green Mill. This mill was first built in 1857, which is about the same time as the Short Point Mill. It really looks pretty lousy there. But if you look at it, it was down where Lakeside Inn used to be, by the yacht club, across from the golf course. And you can, if you look, I think what you can see behind it, it's looking west towards Sylvan Beach and toward the channel. So it's jutting out into the water a little ways. And that mill was built in 1857, had a lot of different owners and a lot of different names over that time. James finally bought it in 1879. And here's the location today. You can see White Lake up there at the top. Former Lakeside Inn site, which now has 3 large homes built on it. South Shore Drive and Scenic Drive meet right there. That's that 4-way stop right by the golf course. And you can see the yacht club over here. And I think the mill was right about there, jutting out into the water. So now the Daltons are up to 3 mills that they've had. The Silver Creek, which they still have. The Short Point, which they don't have, but they still have their homes there, or James does. And the Michelinda Mill is what I call it. I think James called it the Bay Mill. It was called the Green Mill, a lot of different things. So as the lumber industry on White Lake began to wane starting in the 1880s, the Dalton family kind of did the same thing. In 1880, Edward died. He was living in Watseka, Illinois at the time, but he died in Montague, buried in Whitehall. In 1883, James removed the equipment from the Michelinda Mill, and his sons took it up to Menominee to do lumbering up there. Andrew and James, Captain James, both died in 1885 in Montague. This is where the Michelinda Mill, the Green Mill was. I think it's where that juts out into the water there. And this is in 1898 when Peter's daughter Emma and her husband George Mason had a store and post office there that became Lakeside Inn. And this was later, after Lakeside Inn was started in 1913, they put the Michelinda ferry dock, and I think the Goodrich boats came in there. And some of what you can see up above on the hill in both of these pictures is some of the mill buildings that were left even after the mill was gone. So these are the Dalton brothers. I actually have pictures of these two. James, I think that must have been taken when he was in the legislature. He's all dressed pretty fancy for a lumbering guy or even a boat captain. And Peter just looks to me like the down-to-earth guy who stayed home and ran the mill and took care of business. So in 1880, just to recap quickly, Sand Creek Mill, the Chicago Lumber Yard, the Silver Creek Mill, the water routes, homes at Short Point, the Michelinda Mill, Grand River Port at Grand Haven, White Lake Port. That was a lot for the family from where they started. So that's 1880 before James died. And back to remembering the eastern white pine that made it all happen. And that is pretty much the end of the story. And there's what the White Lake Harbor looked like in the early 1900s, about the time. I ended this in 1900 because that's when Catherine died, the sister. And she had, nobody talks about women in history. I had a heck of a time finding anything about Margaret. Nobody even, the histories talk about her sons coming, but they don't talk about her, but she was here. Mary, I still have a hard time finding anything about her, but she ended up living in Evanston, Illinois, and when she died, she owned some land here and left it to her nieces, Peter's daughters. I don't know what she was doing there. At one point, she was in Chicago with her dad. Catherine seemed to continue her kind of adventurous spirit. She lived with any member of the family different times. She spent a lot of time here in White Lake, mostly here, especially after Peter and his wife died and left their children. She helped out with a boarding house at one of the mills for a while. And ultimately, she was involved in a lot of land transactions that they had. I see her name all over the place, and owned land in her own right. Ultimately, she bought a house and lived in Grand Rapids until she died. But nonetheless, like the rest of the family, she died in Montague. Came back here to die. So that, I think, is pretty much it. Went a little longer than I intended, but not too bad. So thanks for your attention. I hope you at least learned a couple of new things.